Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Welcome to Business Over Breakfast, and thank you for joining us today. We're glad you're spending your morning with us, even though this is an incredibly troubling and painful time in the US, with lives being violently taken in Buffalo, Uvalde, and yesterday in Tulsa. It's an unwelcome reminder of things that we often take for granted. So keep your loved ones close and give them an extra hug. Today's topic is another in our focus on how technologies and our adoption of them during COVID has changed how we live. We're exploring AI and machine learning and how recommendation systems shape consumer preferences. And this is really relevant today. Many of us, most of us changed how we shop during COVID. For many of us, we turned to online shopping. I certainly did. My family certainly did. This impacted brand loyalty and also meant that online personalized product recommendations just became ubiquitous. Supposedly, these recommendations reduce friction by helping consumers like me, like you, find items that our tastes, that fit our tastes in what are very crowded markets. But the ability to make product recommendations by monitoring our online spending habits can also have unexpected consequences. And as customers and consumers, as we feel more empowered, competitive advantage can shift from purely competing on product and price to building trust. So the question that we marketers are asking today is, do these hyper-personalized marketing approaches build or destroy trust? And here to help us explore recent research into this question around personalization systems and online recommendations is Jessie Boxted, Professor of Information Systems and Operations Management at Goizueta Business School. Jessie uses researches user behavior and economic issues in the context of information technology, internet business models, and AI and machine learning. His research has appeared in leading academic journals, and he's currently working on research exploring people's preferences for working with AI versus human experts in judgment tasks. Not only is he an active researcher, he's a great teacher, and he teaches both data visualization and AI and machine learning to degree and executive education audiences. So if you are interested in this topic and want to delve more deeply into this, please consider joining Jessie and executive education at a 2-day course that he's running at the end of August on AI and machine learning for business executives. As usual, Jessie will spend probably the first 35 minutes sharing his insights and research, followed by Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and also in chat. If there's any questions that are sort of contextual about and questions about the content then and there, we'll ask them. Otherwise, we will spend the time at the end of this morning session answering as many of those questions as we can. Jessie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you everyone for giving me your time this morning. I know time is our most valuable asset, and so I appreciate you spending the next 45 minutes to an hour with me to talk about something that's very exciting to me, obviously my research, but also just how technologies impact consumers. And so with that, let's get started. Today's talk is going to be about something called recommender systems, which is a technology that is built on machine learning and is used quite extensively in online commerce. And we'll talk a little bit about how recommender systems work, but we'll primarily talk about how recommender systems and the output, the recommendations they produce for consumers actually have some unintended consequences on consumer behavior and how that impacts not only consumers, but also the businesses that use recommender systems themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about some strategies for maybe overcoming some of these issues that we've explored in research. So just a little bit about me before we start. Nicola gave a very thankful for the nice introduction. As she mentioned, I'm a professor here at Goizueta in the ISOM area, Information Systems and Operations Management. I like to think we're kind of the tech nerds of the business school. And I've been at Goizueta for 6 years, but I've been a professor for 13 years. And before joining Goizueta, I was at the University of Arizona for a while. And before that at George Mason University. Prior to academia, I worked for a while in industry. I worked at Accenture in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was actually there when, for any of you who have any history in management consulting, when it was when it was Anderson Consulting, and they split off from Arthur Anderson due to Enron and renamed themselves Accenture. So I got to be there for all that kind of fun stuff. I've also worked with IBM Research in their services research group, first as a PhD intern, but then also as a staff member for a little while while I was finishing up my PhD. As Nicola mentioned, I study, my research focuses on how consumers interact with technology, primarily online technology, internet technologies. And currently, a lot of the research I've been doing is how technologies that are built on AI and machine learning impact the way consumers kind of make purchases, how they behave, and how it kind of impacts just overall consumer experience online. I have a wife, Katie, who's a veterinarian and originally from Atlanta, which is one of the big reasons we ended up back here in Atlanta and about 6 years ago. And I have 2 kids, Billy and Maisie, 7-year-old who's as of tomorrow will be a rising 2nd grader, and a 4-year-old who is very proud to be a rising pre-K student next year. So those are my 2 kids from a recent trip, our first trip we took in the COVID era, just a couple of months ago to go to the Turks and Caicos. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to my faculty website at Goizueta's website, or you can check out my personal website at boxed.com. Thanks again for joining me this morning. All right, so the topic today, we're going to talk about recommender systems and consumer preferences, and this idea of something that my co-authors and I have kind of termed preference pollution. And we'll talk a little about what that means over the next 30 minutes. And I'm going to be reviewing several studies that I and my colleagues have done over the last 8 to 10 years in this stream of research that looks at how personalized recommendations or personalization systems that produce recommendations for consumers that are specific to those consumers have unintended consequences. And so this research has appeared in a number of places. There's an article in MIT Sloan Management Review from a couple of years ago that summarizes some of our work. We have an article coming out in AI Magazine in the next issue, I think the summer issue, which is supposed to come out in a couple of days, in the next month or so, that is summarizing a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. And then we have several studies that we've published that are more academic in nature that have been appeared in kind of our common academic journals, such as MIS Quarterly and Information Systems Research. So I'm going to be referencing several studies over the course of this talk. And since we only have 30 minutes, I won't go into a ton of detail on each one, but if you have any questions or specific questions about how we did things or how that study worked, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll answer those questions as we go. All right, and I also want to just acknowledge my co-authors. This is a stream of research that started, the kind of seeds of this started after I'd finished my PhD at the University of Minnesota, but was having lunch with Sean and Geddes, who were 2 of my PhD advisors when I was a student. And we came up with some ideas of pursuing this topic. And then Jingjing is a good friend of mine who's at Indiana University, who also did her PhD at University of Minnesota. So all of us have a University of Minnesota connection. All right, great. So recommender systems. You probably see personalized recommendations on a daily basis, probably multiple times per day. The kind of canonical case for recommender systems is Netflix. When Netflix first came out as a business and was mailing DVDs to people at home, one of the big value adds that they promoted for consumers was personalized movie recommendations. So help the consumer find movies that they may not know about so that they can enjoy and find new items, new things to consume that they may not have been aware of. And so Netflix has always been kind of at the heart of this kind of recommender system movement. And the idea is that they have a system that uses machine learning techniques to learn people's preferences based on what they consume and what other people that are like them consume, so that they can recommend new items to you that you may not have ever thought of. Now, there's many applications of recommender systems in modern e-commerce. If you go to Spotify, you have your top recommendations for you, or Apple Music. If you go to Amazon, you've got your items that are recommended to you, books or all types of different items. If you go to Facebook, it'll recommend posts to you. Instagram, your feed is largely driven by a recommender system. Most content and most kind of e-commerce sites that you interact with online have some form of recommender system that is trying to create personalized experience for you to help you navigate the overwhelming amount of information that there is on the internet. And so this is the fundamental problem that recommender systems are trying to solve, is that we have this issue of what we call information overload, where there is just too much information out there for us as humans to process. So how do we help consumers and users find relevant information more easily? So Amazon has literally millions and millions of products. How do we find the right ones for Jesse so that he's not wasting all of his time looking through Amazon to try to find different products? But there's also a benefit for the firms as well. Not only does it help consumers find products, which of course leads to more purchases for the firms, it also helps firms with inventory management. One of the interesting things about Netflix's first recommender system when they were in the DVD mailing model was that the recommender system actually helped them have leaner inventory. If you can think about back then, when you actually had to mail a physical DVD to everyone, there was some inventory constraints. You had to have enough copies of DVDs to meet the demand for each title. So for example, if everyone wanted to watch Titanic, in order to meet that demand, you on one hand would have to have millions of copies of Titanic, which is cost prohibitive. However, the recommender system was able to point people to lesser known movies, more obscure movies that maybe were similar to Titanic, in order to kind of divert some of the demand from those big popular movies into other lesser known movies. And that actually helped them have a leaner inventory management system. So recommender systems also help companies manage their inventory. And in today's modern Netflix with streaming, the recommender system also provides that benefit in terms of royalty fees for the content that it shows. So they can use the recommender system to point consumers to things that they were probably like that maybe cost them less in terms of royalty fees, maybe their own self-produced content versus something where they have to pay an expensive fee in order to show it on Netflix. So there are many benefits to net recommender systems. Now, how recommender systems work, just very briefly, you can do a whole class on this because there are many different approaches, but there are generally kind of two high-level approaches to how recommender systems work, and many recommender systems use a combination of these two to produce recommendations. The first is something called collaborative filtering, which is sounds very, very complicated, but really what it is it's about finding similar people. If you're doing what's called user-based collaborative filtering, finding people that are similar to each other in terms of their tastes. So for example, we have two users here that have watched a bunch of similar movies on Netflix. So their profiles are very similar. And then we look for things that this user has already watched, but this user hasn't. And then we recommend those things to the user that hasn't watched it yet. So we find people that are very similar, and then we figure out things that one person has watched and recommend that to the other person. That's the general idea of collaborative filtering. And then there's what's called content-based filtering, where you look at things that a user has watched and you take a look at the content or the items they purchased and the characteristics of those items, and you get an idea of what types of things they like based on the item characteristics. And then you find other items that have similar characteristics. So for example, maybe you're someone who likes to watch a lot of hard sci-fi movies that have a strong female lead and take place in outer space. So they start recommending movies to you that have those similar types of characteristics. Okay, so those are kind of generally how things work. And then the back end, obviously, there's a lot of math and statistical learning processes that are going on, largely driven by machine learning methods. However, the issue that we're going to explore comes in with what happens when personalized recommendations are given to a user and they actually impact the way people feel about the things that they've consumed. So the goal of a recommender system is to help you discover stuff that you might like, which is really good. It's a key value add in modern e-commerce. But we're going to talk about an issue is after you've consumed something, how did that recommendation actually impact your consumption process and lead to a biased outcome of actually consuming that product? So what's interesting is the way recommender systems work, a recommendation is created. So a recommender system starts by having a lot of information about consumers in order to make recommendations to them. So in order for a recommender system to provide a personalized product recommendation to a consumer, it has to have information about that consumer's preferences. So when you first join Netflix, first thing it asks you to do is rate a bunch of movies. You go through and say, these are my top movies. These are the genres I like. These are I rate like 100 movies out of 5 stars. That gives them some seed information to start producing recommendations to you. So it uses that. It creates a recommendation by looking at all the movies in their library and predicting how well you're going to like a movie, for example. And then the ones that have the higher scores, it gives them to you in a list and says, hey, these are some movies that you might like to watch. You go and watch that movie. And then afterwards, it asks you, how well did you like that movie? Thumbs up, thumbs down, 4 out of 5 stars, 5 out of 5 stars, etc. And then that information goes back into the recommender system and provides it more data so that it can learn more and provide you new movie recommendations over time. And the way most recommendation systems measure how good they are, how accurate they are, is they compare, right? If I give you a movie, let's say Jesse gets a movie recommended to him, I don't know, Titanic is recommended to me, and because they think that my preference for that is I'm going to like it 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then I watch the movie and then I rate it and I say, I liked it 4 out of 5 stars. Well, that's how they measure the accuracy. How good was the prediction compared to how I actually rated it, right? So they thought I was going to like it 4.5. I said I liked it 4. And so that gives us an idea of how good the recommender system is, how well it can predict that rating after the fact. But what we're going to talk about is just the simple fact of giving me this prediction and this personalized rating to begin with actually changes how I feel about the thing I consume after the fact. And it actually biases my ratings. So when I present someone a recommendation and say, hey, we think you're really going to love this movie, and then I watch the movie, I tend to say that I like it more than if you had never told me that in the first place and just had me watch the movie on its own with no prior information. And so this is what we're going to talk about, is bias. So by presenting these personalized recommendations to consumers, it actually changes the way they feel about it if you've never presented that in the first place. And it creates some issues with how they rate the movies and then how that relates to system performance and accuracy. It also creates some issues with potential trust for consumers. So in a nutshell, that's what this stream of research is about. Now, one of the questions might be, are biases bad, right? If you're a company like Netflix or a company like Amazon and you tell someone they're going to really love a movie, they watch it, and the fact that you told them that makes them love the movie more, why is that a bad thing? Maybe that's a good thing. That's good for business, right? Maybe it gets them to buy more stuff or pay more or be able to feel better about their experience. And in one sense, yes, that's true. But there are some issues that can arise. One is the system itself, because of the way accuracy is measured and performance is measured, that can actually erode performance of the system over time. And we'll look at some results of some simulations that have been recently done that show that. It can also lead to kind of a distorted view of items for users, right? You're, in a sense, potentially creating underlying effects in how the users think about the items in the system, which could lead to kind of a trust issue later. It can artificially pull consumers' preferences in certain directions. So if you have inaccuracy in your recommendations, if they're artificially high, you may be inflating consumers' thoughts about your products, which maybe aren't true and could result in a backfire later. If your recommendation system is artificially low because of issues with recommendations, it could make people feel worse about your products. So it can change consumers' preferences in a way that maybe you don't want. And one interesting thing is it provides opportunities for manipulation of recommender systems. So when consumers put in ratings, they actually affect the underlying performance of the system. And this gives users the ability to potentially manipulate the system and how the recommendations are created. All right. So overall, bias is not necessarily a good thing, and something that may be something we want to mitigate. All right. So we're going to talk about a few studies now over the next 15, 20 minutes. And now that we've kind of given an overview of the topic, and just most of these studies, I'm not going to go into details. I just want to give you an idea that they're all based on randomized experiments that we've done with recommender systems with users, where what we do is we have participants actually come in and rate a bunch of things, and then we start giving them recommendations, and we manipulate how those recommendations are given to them. We use a randomized kind of controlled study format so that we can look at kind of what we call causal inference in academia, but basically so that we know the effects we're seeing are actually caused by the things we're doing. And we have users consume these items, and then we have them tell us how much they like them or how much they'll pay for them or other certain measures about the consumer experience. And so a key thing I want to point out here is that all these effects that we're going to talk about are what we call post-consumption. This is after the consumer has consumed the item, has used the item, has watched the movie, has played the game, has read the book. And so that's why this is interesting. If we told you that Netflix says, we think you're going to like this movie 4 to 5 stars, and then we ask them before they watch the movie, how much do you think you're going to like this? We would surely expect them to say they're going to like it more because Netflix told them they'd like it more. But what we're doing is we're measuring it after they actually watch the movie. And so they've had the chance to experience it for themselves. Even after they've watched it and had their full experience of it, they tend to have preferences that are changed based on what the system told them ahead of time. And that's interesting because normally we would expect that not to happen. Once they've watched it, they'd have a clear view of it. It should be their own preference for it and not biased by what they were told beforehand, but we're seeing the opposite. All right. So our first study we did, I think in like about 2012, what we did is we ran a study where we had people come into the lab and they rated a bunch of TV shows and movies, just like you would when you join Netflix. And then we gave them a TV show to watch. This was a short-lived TV show called Andy Barker, PI. And we had them watch a 25-minute episode of this sitcom. And afterwards, we asked them how much they liked this TV show. We asked them to rate this TV show out of 5 stars. But for some of the people randomly, before they watched the show, we said, hey, our system thinks you're going to like this show 4.5 out of 5 stars. And for some people, we said, we think you're going to like this 1.5 out of 5 stars. And for others, we said right in the middle. And then some people we didn't give any recommendations to. And so what we did is we randomly gave them false recommendations. So the system was telling them how much we thought they were going to like it, but it was just kind of made up so that some people saw high, some people saw low. And what we saw is when the people watched this show, at the end of it, the control group was right in the middle, right? The control group was the people we didn't say anything to. Their average rating was right in the middle of all, kind of right in the middle of everything. But the people that we said, hey, we think you're going to like this movie a lot, after they watched the show, they said they liked it a lot. The people we said, we don't think you're going to like this show very much, after they watched it, they didn't like it very much. Jeff Miller, anchoring bias, 100%. That's exactly what we think the mechanism that's operating here. But what's interesting is that anchoring bias is typically measured as just kind of a simple numeric anchoring that happens. And this is actually in preference creation and preference formation, which is a little bit beyond what has been explored in prior studies on anchoring bias. But Jeff, I think you're right on. That's what we think is the underlying mechanism that is driving this. So great question. If you're not familiar with the idea of anchoring, this is a concept from behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, which is the idea that when you present information to someone before making a judgment, that information can anchor them so that they kind of move away from that information to make their judgment. So the classic case is there was an example that was done by Kahneman Tversky where they asked a bunch of people some questions. For example, what do they think the population of a certain country is? And before they got their judgment of what that population was, for some people, they told them, they just randomly had them think about a high number, and other people, they randomly had to think about a little bit lower number. And then, of course, when they were asked to give an estimate about the population of this country, the people that were given the high number that had nothing to do with population tended to give higher estimates of the population versus people given the lower number. So we think anchoring has something to do with this, but it's not precisely anchoring because there's this aspect of preference and consumption of the good that is going on as well. But great comment. So this was kind of our initial study. It was published in Information Systems Research, and we see that there's this clear, almost perfectly linear relationship where the lower the rating we give someone before they consume, the lower the preference they give afterwards, and the higher we give, the higher. So we see this kind of almost linear relationship that we have. Now, we've tested this in several different contexts. We've done it with movies, we've done it with jokes, with TV shows, we've also done it with song purchases. So we've seen this as a pretty robust effect that we see on consumer preferences, how they prefer something changes after they consume it based on what we told them in a personalized recommendation ahead of time. All right, so the general idea here is the consumer has some unbiased preference for something. If you just had them watch a movie, for example, without telling them anything ahead of time, they're going to form their preference for it after they consume the movie, and that's what we call that their unbiased preference. That's what they would say if they just watched the movie on their own. But if we give them a recommendation, that recommendation can actually pull their preferences one way or the other. And so, for example, in our studies, if we said to people, we think you're going to like this movie a lot, it actually, as Jeff mentioned, creates an anchor, we think is the mechanism, and that actually pulls their preference, what they say they like the movie after the fact, to be higher. If they got a recommendation that said, we don't think you're going to like this very much, and they watch it, that tends to pull their preference in the other direction. So this is what we mean by bias preference, and generally what we mean by preference pollution, because what happens then is these preferences then get fed back into the recommender system, which are used to create new recommendations and measure the performance of the system, and then can have kind of rippling effects in the system. Okay. Now we wanted to extend this study because it's one thing to say, you watch a TV show, how much did you like this show? When there's nothing at stake, right? You're just saying how much I like this show. I'm in some study. I mean, we clearly saw these effects, but how does that translate to like actual economic behavior? So we ran a second study with songs where we did very similar setup. They listened to a bunch of songs, they rated a bunch of songs, and we gave them recommendations for songs. Some of them were inflated high and some of them were low. But this time what we did is they had actual real money involved and they were making real purchases. And so we asked them how much would they pay for a song based on after listening to it. And what we see is that the control group is about 25 cents. And this was back, we did this a few years ago before all the streaming stuff became popular. So this was, 2014 time period where people were still buying songs on Apple Music and things like that for $1. And so we see that when we give them low recommendations versus high recommendations, we see a significant difference in how much people were willing to pay for the good. So it's not just a rating, it actually translated into their amount to pay or what they valued the good at when they actually had to pay their own money in order to purchase these goods. So we saw about a 20% increase in what they were willing to pay by just increasing what we recommended to them by 1 star out of a 5-star scale. So if we said, you're going to like this 4.5 out of 5 stars versus 3.5, we saw a 10 to 20% increase in what they were willing to pay. And I will note that the subjects in this were college students. So the fact that we could get any of them to be willing to pay 26 cents for a song, I thought was also a pretty interesting finding at that time. So, so we see that it impacts not just what they say their preferences are for something after they consume it, it actually impacts how much they're willing to pay for it as well. And then additional study we did was, okay, so these are personalized recommendations. So we're saying to someone, our system is making this recommendation based on all these sophisticated machine learning algorithms. What happens if we're not using system recommendations that are personalized, but we're just using kind of general ratings of things? So for example, you go to any website these days and they have a rating system that tells you, for example, 15,000 people have bought this product on Amazon, and on average, they like it 4.5 out of 5 stars, for example. All right, so how does this relate? Personalized recommendations versus these kind of like average ratings we get from the populace. And in kind of academic parlance, this is, kind of the social impact. How does everybody else think about this versus the personalized impact, right? How does the effect of how I think this is going to be for me versus how does everybody else think, right? And so, for example, on Netflix, for a long time, they used to have this rating system where it was, out of stars. And so, for example, this was a recommendation for my colleague, Jingjing. Our best guess for Jingjing was 3.8. So this is that personalized recommendation. And then this is the average rating of all users, 4.2. So what happens when these two things are both presented and we see? And what we found when we did this was that both have strong effects on people's preferences after consuming the product. So if you took away the personalized stuff and just showed the average ratings of all the users that saw it, you saw similar effects where the ones that had the higher average rating after someone consumed it, they had higher preferences for it. However, if they're both in agreement, if they're both high or they're both low, it doesn't really have any additive effect. It doesn't get any stronger. But if they're in conflict, for example, if the personalized rating is high and the average rating of all the other users is low, then the personalized recommendation drives the effect. So we see that people think they like something more if the personalized rating says that you'll like it more. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? How consumers interact. If personalization saying is that we think you specifically are going to love this movie, even though everybody else hated it, it makes kind of sense that people will be like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I'm different. I'm not like everybody else. My tastes are unique. And so I think that kind of makes sense that we're seeing this, right? So the takeaway here is that personalized recommendations are really, really strong. They have a really strong effect, but we also have some effects from just kind of these general overview ratings of everybody that's watched a movie or consumed a product. Now, my colleague Geddes and one of his new PhD students are doing some very interesting simulations right now. They have some work that is under review where they actually simulated recommender systems at a very large scale. And they said, what happens to the performance of the recommender system when you take into consideration these biases? When you take into consideration that consumers' preferences that they report after they consume something are going to be biased based on the recommendations that are provided. And in these large scale simulations, they found some very interesting things. 3 very common measures of performance of recommender systems all are impacted very, very strongly by the introduction of these types of biases. So one very common thing is just accuracy. I talked about this earlier, but how well it predicts how much someone is going to like something. And in this first chart here, generally we see over time, RMSE is a measure of error. So how much error there is between my prediction for someone's preference and what they actually say their preference is. We see that, for the 0 bias, over time, the system gets better. The error gets lower and lower and lower and lower. But as you increase the bias that's introduced in the system, as we've been talking about it, we see that accuracy actually does not get better over time. And in the case of large bias, 1 is 1 star out of 5. So if you had a 5-star rating system, if you introduced an average bias of, the consumer's purported preferences is 1 star inflated or deflated from where it should be, we actually see that the system's accuracy gets worse over time. The other smaller biases, it still gets better, but not as quickly. But for really large biases, we see the opposite effect. The system's performance actually gets worse and worse and worse over time, which is obviously not a good thing for the company using the system. And then in terms of another common measure of performance in the recommender system is something called diversity. And diversity is a measure of how diverse the set of products are that the set of products are that a consumer is seeing. Because more diverse products usually means a more happy customer. And we see a similar effect. The bigger the bias, the less the diversity over time. And then some other simulations here show that relevance, another measure of performance, is how relevant are the products that are being recommended to the consumer. And we see that when bias is big, we get a huge drop off in relevance over time, right? So just a few things we got about 5 or 6 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes here to wrap up, then we'll take some questions. But things we know are that preference pollution is consistent, robust, and durable at an aggregate effect across a number of different situations and types of goods. We've tested this across many different types of goods, mostly online consumable goods like movies, jokes, TV shows, etc. We have seen different types of preference judgments and responses that have been affected, relevance judgments, willingness to pay judgments, etc. Timing is also is something we'll talk about in a second. Types of recommendations, where the recommendation comes from, and when we collect the recommendations, all we see a robust effect. Right. So there's a few ways first half of the stream research was try to figure out what was happening. The second half of this research has been how do we mitigate it? How do we get this bias to go away? And so one of the first things we did was said, all right, what if we separated the time from which the person consumes the item and then reports their preference back to us? Maybe the problem is I watch the movie in the lab, we tell them, hey, you're going to love this movie. We have them watch the movie right away, and then we immediately ask for their preference. Maybe that time is too short in between those things. And if we spread out and don't ask for their preference until like a few days later, maybe that will alleviate this issue. So we ran some studies where we did the same thing we did before. We had people rate a bunch of TV shows. They got a TV show recommendation. They watched the TV show. And then we had a bunch of different delay conditions until we went back to them and said, hey, how well did you like this TV show? So we tried no delay immediately, 1 day, 3 days, and 5 days. And what we found is that that has no effect on the bias. We actually still see the bias even 5 days later. So we give you a recommendation today. If you watch a movie right after that, even if we wait 5 days, we still see this effect where high recommendation before watching it, high preference later, high recommendation, low recommendation below it, low preference for it later. So separating it temporally doesn't seem to have any effect on reducing the bias. So a second mitigation strategy we tried in a different study was maybe how we present the information from the recommendation to the user could have an effect. So we ran a study where we did the same thing we've done in all of our previous studies, but now we've changed how the recommendation is presented to the user before they consume the good. So these are the different ways we presented it. In some cases, we were very precise and we said, you're going to like this 3.0 out of 5. Some we said numeric, you're going to like it somewhere in this range. Then we gave kind of graphical. We got rid of the numbers because, to Jeff's point earlier, the anchor is very salient if it is a number. If we say specifically you're going to like it 3.5 out of 5, maybe that's too salient. So what if we make it a little bit more vague? And so we used some graphics to represent that. We tried stars, and then we did thumbs up and thumbs down, because at the time, Apple Music had just kind of introduced thumbs up and thumbs down. And shortly after our study, actually, Netflix went to a thumbs up, thumbs down versus a 5-star rating. So we ran the study, and what we found here was that information representation seems to be a pretty good way to mitigate bias. In particular, non-numeric type representations of the recommendation seem to be best for minimizing bias. So our situation where we showed a thumbs up or thumbs down instead of a specific 4.5 out of 5 scale had the lowest amount of bias. It didn't go away completely, but it had a much lower bias than when we showed a specific number. And interestingly, I have no idea if we had any impact on Netflix, but very shortly after we presented this, not very shortly, about a year after we presented this at a conference, Netflix changed their recommender system so that they were having a different type of system where you're actually rating things on a thumbs up, thumbs down. And instead of showing stars, they were showing a percent match. So definitely not taking any credit that we impacted how Netflix thought about this, but I do think that companies that use recommender systems are aware of how these things are, can maybe impact consumers and are testing different ways to present recommendations. And then one other mitigation strategy we've tried is something in recommender systems, which is called top end lists. So instead of providing people a recommendation that has a specific value or specific information about that item that says, we think you're going to love this item, or we think you're going to like this item 4.5 out of 5, we give them a list. And that list is just like, hey, these are 25 items we think you're going to love, but we don't necessarily rank them. We don't necessarily give values to them to say, hey, this item is really good for you. This one's sort of good. We just kind of say, here's 25 items we think are good for you. Like, for example, Spotify does in their Discover weekly list. And what we found there is the bias tends to go away. So this points back to Jeff's point earlier that we think really it's related to anchoring, right? That there has to be kind of a salient anchor that the consumer sees that kind of sets them and their mind on something that then impacts how they construct their preference for when they consume the good, and then relates to how much they will pay for it and how high they'll rate the good. Right. Now, some other things that could also be done is, I think, is an exciting new area for research. Most stuff we've done before is kind of preventing these biases in the first place, but there's also the idea of ex post facto, after the biases have actually been created and are in the system, can we remove them? Can we identify them and remove them? And so I think there's some interesting areas for research that we're kind of starting to work on there. And but it's challenging because you have to have the ability to capture the right data and think about how you would identify these biases and pull them out. But I think that's where kind of the research is going in this area. So to conclude, since we have about 15, 20 minutes left, we can have some questions and talk. I think this is interesting and fun. It's really fun research because we get to sit and have people watch movies and TV shows and see how they react. But it's also very big, right? If you think about the impact of some of these things, the potential impact and how these kind of recommender systems and personalization systems can impact consumer behavior. Even if there's small impacts at the scale at which most of these e-commerce companies operate, they can have huge overall impacts on bottom line and trust and all these sort of things. So fundamentally, the challenge that we're trying to address with this line of research is that there's this paradoxical relationship for these types of personalization systems. On one hand, they need to be very useful for consumers pre-consumption, before I watch a movie, before I buy a book, before I choose a restaurant. These things need to be good at helping me find things that I'm gonna like. But they also should not influence how I feel about that thing when I actually consume it. That should be independent, right? I should be able to go to a restaurant and make my own decision about how much I like that restaurant and not have it be biased by the recommendation I got from Yelp. And so that's the paradox that we're trying to understand and trying to solve here. And I think it's an important and problem-rich area for ongoing research. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions or go into more detail about any of the specific studies we did, or just talk about just general things. I'd love to hear from the audience your experience with recommender systems, and if you work at companies that use them, anything that relates. So
thanks so much, Jesse. In fact, we
sure.
have some comments and some questions. Kamishra, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, made a comment that as a consumer who would like to define her own preferences, it's disturbing to know that AI is trying to interpret her behavior to predict her preferences and pull those preferences in another way. So I think she just made a comment there about, I don't think I've ever rated a movie on any platforms. However, I'm likely to recommend a movie to my daughter or a friend. That has more meaning to me than submitting a rating to a platform. So
100%. Yeah. I
feel this is a little sort of invasive.
Yes, I think that's good. I like to hear that, because, my view of this is, I come at this from a consumer protection type viewpoint. Like, to me, I want this to be something that consumers know about, so that they understand that these systems oftentimes unintentionally will impact the way they like. I don't think, for example, Netflix or Amazon is intentionally trying to manipulate consumers with the way these systems work. I mean, I could be wrong, but but it's just the fact that the way they work and the way the information is presented can have that impact. I think it's good for consumers to know, so that they can kind of step back and make an independent view. And I think the comment about not putting ratings on these platforms is perfect. If you don't want to have these types of issues, and there's way more issues than just what we're talking about here with personalization and privacy and all that kind of stuff, then opting out is your best option, right? Just not participating. Now, there are people that find value in these things, right? For example, if you're an avid Netflix watcher, using the platform and providing ratings hopefully is providing you content that is good for you and that you'd like to see. And so that's the argument from the consumer side, that it's helping you find things that are of value to you that you might not ever have seen. But I think that what we call the privacy paradox, that people want to be private, but they also want to enjoy these things, that this personalization stuff is a tough thing to kind of address. And there's a lot of actually research in kind of the privacy area on this specific thing. One thing to note, though, is that you don't necessarily have to rate a movie for them to develop for them to develop a profile of you. So just buying a movie, just clicking on a movie, just looking at it on Amazon for more than a couple seconds, all those pieces of information are being collected and fed into something that is probably being used to recommend things to you. So even if you are, this is a common problem in recommender systems, is they call it sparsity, which is, people don't necessarily rate enough stuff to be able to create good recommendations and profiles. And so they find other ways to capture information about what you like and what you don't like. Did you add it to your shopping cart? Did you buy it? Did you look at it for a long time? Did you watch the video, that came with the product? All those pieces of information are being collected. So, yeah.
So here's an interesting one. This participant says, I'm interested in the application of this knowledge. For example, assume an email was sent yesterday to attendees that stated, Goizueta thinks the breakfast would resonate with you at 4.5 out of 5 stars. Would that impact the results of our feedback post-webinar?
Probably. I mean, that's what the research is telling us, is that yes, if we had primed you with an anchor prior to the start of this webinar, which is a good idea. Next time I give this talk, we might try that. Maybe we'll randomly give some people low and some people high and see what happens. But that's what our research is basically telling us, is that yes, we would expect that. Given now, I haven't tried it with a Zoom webinar before, but we've tried it with a lot of other what we call information goods, where you're watching content, and we see a very robust effect where that type of an anchor given before consumption impacts how people feel about it ahead of consumption. And there's actually, this is a known but not often discussed fact in academics, is that professors' ratings at the end of the course are often highly correlated to how the first day went, or how people felt about them on the first day of the course. And they're often highly correlated to what people tell them before they even take the course, if they're going to like it or not. So I think this effect is robust beyond just what we're talking about with recommendation systems. It's just gotten hugely amplified because of e-commerce and because we see these things constantly. So
maybe we should do an experiment, Jesse, for your upcoming AI and machine learning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that'd be fun. So as long as we're only doing the high ones, but to your point, also, I think this is another thing to think about too, is that as a business or a marketer, the takeaway may be, well, I should just do that all the time. I should just always prime my customers that they're going to love these things beforehand. And one thing I want people to take away from this is that I don't think that's a great strategy, because in the long run, it can erode consumer trust. And as we've shown in our simulations and other research, that it actually can undermine, if you're using a recommender system, it actually undermines performance of the system, which could have a bigger effect over time. So so I don't want the takeaway to be like, hey, let's just tweak our recommendations up to get everybody to be happier about our products. I think in the long run, that's a bad strategy. So it actually erodes the whole system, both technologically and from a trust standpoint. Yeah.
Thank you. So Denise asks, in some areas, for example, groceries, hair care, how much can the recommender systems affect generational biases and or change purchasing habits? So for example, she says, my mother brought Crisco, so it's good enough for me. So how does this work across generations, Jesse?
Yeah, to be frank, I don't know if I can answer that question. That's actually, I might have to write that down as a research question to look in a future study. I mean, recommendations are important. But there are entrenched buying habits of consumers as well. So getting people to switch from a loyal brand to another is a very difficult thing, and recommender systems can have an impact, but that's not largely what, recommendation systems are largely for helping you find things you might not have known about in the first place. So while I'm not going to say they don't have any impact, I would say that's not their sweet spot. So whether or not it's going to convince someone who's been using Crisco for 40 years to switch to a new brand, that I can't say. But what it could do is what they often do is bring awareness to an alternative brand or something that they might like that they may not have known to use in the past. And if the recommendation was high for that thing and your mother chose to try it, there's a good likelihood that they're gonna like it after the fact, that their preference for it will be higher than otherwise. Yeah.
So I've heard that people sometimes paid for their references and preferences, and there's been a significant rise in people that call themselves influencers and so what has been the impact of that, and what should we take away from that?
Well, I think there's a couple issues there. Like one is paid reviews, right? This is a big issue on Amazon and almost all e-commerce platforms. I mean, the estimates, I don't even know what they are now, but there were estimates a few years ago that like 30 to 40% of all reviews on Amazon were paid, fake, or bot. And so that information is information that consumers are seeing when they're making their purchases. And so, that's obviously impacting their consumer choices. And as we looked at in one of our studies, those average ratings even non-personalized ones can have similar effects on consumer preferences. So that, I think there's some issues there. With influencers, I'm not really an expert in influencers and how they impact product consumption, but from what I do know is that it's also common for a lot of these influencers to pay for followers and to bump themselves up and to become these kind of like higher, have higher visibility, oftentimes using bots to drive that in the first place too. And so it's a little bit different than recommendations, but a lot of these influencers, the way they make their money is by making product recommendations. So we haven't looked at that specifically, those types of recommendations, but I would expect there's kind of similar effects. If you've got, an influencer that you follow, which is telling you're going to love something, and then you go consume it, there's probably a higher likelihood that you're going to love it than whether you just stumbled upon it in the first place. Right. Yeah. There's a great, there's a side note. There's a great documentary that I think was on HBO called The Social. I'll have to look it up, but it's a social. I got to find the title, but it's really interesting. They take these. It's like an experiment where they take 3 or 4 people that are kind of borderline influencers, like 4,000 to 5,000 followers, and they use bots to bump them up to different levels of fame, and then they see what happens, and they look at like how their lives change and how they start getting all these things to advertise. They start getting free goods and paid and sponsorships and all this kind of stuff. It's a really interesting documentary that kind of goes into a lot of that issues of how the influencer culture and economy works.
Interesting. Stephen asked a while back, can you speak to the annoyance factor of retargeting ads? And would that also be a source of rating bias?
Yes. So this is a good point. So ads in particular, there's a thing in marketing called the Boomerang Effect, which is if you try to personalize something or market something to someone too much or too strongly or too personally, it can actually backfire and have someone not like the good. And so to this effect of annoyance, right? Seeing annoying ads and seeing it too much, or seeing something that's too in your face or too personal, like how did they know that about me to be able to put that in an ad that's personalized? That can actually have an opposite effect. That can actually make me shy away. It's what we call the boomerang effect, where I say, forget that product, or forget that's too much. And so I think from a company standpoint, they're trying to constantly skirt that fine line between over personalization and just enough personalization to get you to act, right? Or the personalization privacy trade-off, which is what we call it. How do we do stuff that is personal? Because we know personalization works. We know generally personalization drives people to take action and do things, but we want to avoid what feels like an invasion of privacy. There's a great, actually in the class I'm going to teach in a few months, the AI and machine learning for executives, we'll talk about all sorts of things, but one of the cases that we talk about a little bit is Target. Back in 2012, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine. They had a personalization system where they were trying to identify customers and direct market to them specific coupons based on who they were and their shopping habits. And one of the things they did is they were able to discover women that were pregnant based on their shopping habits. Women who are pregnant tend to buy certain things that they might not buy if they weren't pregnant. And so they had a system that identified them and then would send coupons to them in the mail to get them to buy more stuff, because Target's holy grail is getting someone locked in at that stage, and then they will probably be a customer for life. And there's a story where a father came into Target, was mad at the manager because his daughter, who was 16 at the time, got a flyer with a bunch of pregnancy coupons in it and wanted to know why Target knew his daughter was pregnant, but he didn't. And so what they did is they actually got smarter about it, and they sent, and smarter, maybe slimier about it, but they sent coupon mailers to people that they knew were pregnant, that had advertisements or coupons for pregnancy related products, but they weren't just like pregnancy, they were interspersed with a whole bunch of other stuff. So it just looked like it was a generic mailer that anybody got, but really there were targeted ads hidden inside it. And so that's kind of to the point that I think was raised about that privacy versus, annoyance, privacy, and personalization, and kind of understanding that trade-off.
Right. Yeah. So Jesse, I think we've got time for one last question. And
sure.
Ian asks, wouldn't it be easier instead of recommender systems, just give user a choice to see more or less of these things? So everyone's choices come out differently. So less of the content.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I mean, I think that is easier, but I think the argument against that is that there's too much stuff, right? And so that's one thing if you've got a movie library of 100 movies, but Netflix literally has millions of different things to show you. So then the question becomes, how do you present that stuff to someone, right? You know, how do you organize it? Just alphabetical? Is it, you know, so it's just the goodwill behind recommender systems and why they were developed by computer scientists, you know, 20 some years ago or 25 years ago, was to solve this problem. There's so much stuff. How do we help people find things with good intent that, you know, navigating what we call generally information overload? So I think there are all alternatives out there. Not everybody uses recommender systems, but as the size of your content library grows, the ability for consumers to navigate it and find things becomes harder and harder. And so you have to rely on these different types of mechanisms, recommender systems being one of them, to help people find relevant content. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you so much, Jesse.
Yeah.
So Tammy, over to you.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Jesse, so much. That was really great information that you shared. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tammy Long. I'm the Director of Open Enrollment for Executive Education at Goizueta School of Business. And I am going to share with you what we have coming up on Business Over Breakfast, the next webinars to take place. So, Jesse, if you could let me
Yeah, sure. Sorry
sharing.
about that.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay, so what you have to look forward to. On June 16th, we will have our leadership selling, which will be presented by Steve Shepard. The first Thursday in July, so happy July 4th to everyone. We want to acknowledge that in advance. We will not have a Business Over Breakfast on July 7th. A recording of a fan favorite will be distributed though, so you can take a look at that. We will resume on the third Thursday in July on the 21st with Everything in Business Depends in Relationships, and that will be presented by Kimberly Evans. So as the Director of Open Enrollment, I'd be remiss if I didn't share any of our upcoming open enrollment courses with you. And to start it off, I want to share that Jesse will be presenting an open enrollment course on AI and machine learning for business. This will take place on August the 22nd and 23rd. It will be in person. So if you'd like more information and to spend more time with Jesse, please sign up for this open enrollment course. We also
Amy,
have.
can I make one
Yes.
comment on that?
Yes.
This is designed for executives and managers. It's, you know, we will talk about how these things work, but it's not going to be a coding hyper technical. It's more about how these things work in applications. So just don't want to scare anybody off from it being like too technical of a thing.
Good point. Thank you for adding that, Jesse. So again, please sign up for the AI machine learning for business, again, to hear more from Jesse on this subject. Coaching diploma program, we are accepting applications now. This is for advanced and foundations. These classes will begin in August through December for foundations and begin again in January through March for our advanced coaching diploma program. And we also have registration open for our 4-credit MBA courses. So if you've thought about getting your MBA and not sure, and you'd like to kind of dip your toes in and taking a 4-credit course alongside actual MBA students, please sign up for any of our 9 MBA courses that are offered to executive education participants. These courses will take place from August the 24th through December the 6th. We have several courses in finance, so from alternative investments, investment banking, mergers and acquisition, as well as several marketing courses such as customer lifetime valuation and pricing strategy and analytics. There is an application for both the MBA courses as well as the coaching diploma. If you have any questions about any of these courses, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. That's all that we have today. I just want to remind you that a recording of this webinar will be available on the Executive Education LinkedIn page. That brings us to a close. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Jesse, for your presentation and the valuable information that you share with everyone this morning. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.